There is a silent assassin hiding amongst all the natural disasters of the world, and the only evidence that it was ever there is the body count, and it's heat. Today we're going to talk about a heat wave that left behind a death toll 4 times that of the Great Chicago Fire. Viewer discretion is advised. Let's get into today's story. The year is 1896, and Manhattan's population is approaching 1.85 million people. This is about 80,000 people per square mile. How dense is that, you ask? If you took today's world population and made it that dense, you could fit everybody in the state of Wyoming. I know, I did the math. Now, obviously, some neighborhoods are more dense than others, and one of the densest would have been Manhattan's Lower East Side, which definitely had numbers closer to 100,000 people per square mile. Yikes! This neighborhood was well known for its tenement-style buildings. Now, to give you an idea, these rooms are tightly packed, and the number of rooms also depended on the number of families that would be fitting into that tenement. For example, if you had a 2-room tenement, odds are you had 2 families, maybe 5 or 6 people in each family. And if you had extra floor space, chances are you rented it out to single men to sleep on. So a 2-room tenement might house over a dozen people. And you thought your roommate was a nightmare. These rooms also often failed to allow for natural sunlight, air circulation, and even running water. If you did have running water in your building, odds are it was from a communal sink in the hallway that everyone on the floor shared. And if you lived in the upper floors, good luck to you, because that water pressure definitely gets significantly lower in the summertime. And speaking of the summertime, when it got very hot out, a lot of these buildings were made of either brick or stone, so they would almost become little brick ovens, and the buildings would heat up well over 100 degrees, sometimes as far up as 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Let's also take into account that most of the people living in these buildings are day laborers, working 6 days a week, 10 hours a day. Maybe some of them could have been found working at the nearby Williamsburg Bridge, which was under construction, or maybe the flagship store for Lord & Taylor, which was due to open 1 month later. And then you also had people who were working inside of the tenement itself, whether it's in the textile or the tailoring industries. There's also thousands of people who are either homeless or penniless because of a financial panic that started in 1893. We're in year 3 of this financial struggle. In other words, day-to-day life for all of these tenement living people sucks. It is terrible. Buildings occasionally had communal toilets for the entire floor. Otherwise, you probably had a latrine out in the backyard that you shared with the entire building. And in case you haven't figured it out at this point, almost all of these people living in these tenements are immigrants. They have no other choice. This is where you live. Some of you might be sitting there asking, when was the air conditioner invented? Was that available yet? No, we're still 6 years away from that invention, in Brooklyn, by the way. And it didn't even become available to people in their homes until 1932. So we're well before the invention of the air conditioner and it being available to people in their homes. Well, hey, maybe sit in a cool bathtub, right? That might be a good idea. Try to cool yourself down that way. Oh, you're rich. Yeah, if you were wealthy, you might have had that luxury. But all of these poor people had a communal spigot in their backyard, and this is what your bath looked like. You would take a bucket, fill that up, and then you would bring it upstairs into the tenement, and everyone would get a rag, which you would dip in the bucket, and you'd pat yourself down, and that's how you would get clean. That was your bath. Are you there yet? Have you figured out how horrible the living conditions are for these immigrant families? Yeah? Okay, let's go on to August 4th, 1896. This date would begin a span of 10 days where the temperatures were over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, or in the sun, sometimes well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity levels were at 90%, and there was barely any wind. These temperatures wouldn't start to drop until well into the evening as well. Now, here's the thing about heat. It kills slowly. It lingers. It watches you die before it leaves the room. Now, in 1896, there is a law in place that forbids people from sleeping in public parks. If you are an immigrant, you don't really have a choice. You have to follow the rules because the law is not kind to immigrants. If the city had simply lifted this ban, odds are they would have saved a ton of lives. People were looking to escape the confines of their apartment. They needed fresh air. So people were looking to sleep on rooftops, on fire escapes, on piers, get close to the river. However, unfortunately, room became very difficult to come by, and if you were on a rooftop, you might have to sleep close to the edge, and if you simply roll over in the middle of the night, you might plummet 5 stories off of the building. If you're on the pier, you roll over, you might end up in the East River, and you drown. It wasn't just the heat that was killing everybody in 1896. Now, as far as what the heat did, the heat would slowly start to make all of your internal organs shut down, one by one. It would be a very slow process, lasting several days. You would be very lightheaded, you'd suffer intense headaches, you would vomit profusely, and you'd be so dehydrated that even if you put a gallon of water into you, the heat stroke had already done its job. A lot of businesses looked into changing the work schedule so that they weren't making their employees stand out in the midday sun, which was a lot more than the government was doing, by the way. There was a lot of laissez-faire going on at this point, so they were very hands-off as far as looking at how to help the poor people in New York City. During this 10-day span, hundreds, if not thousands, of horses died in the streets, and they would just collapse right there onto the road, and people would leave them there. The carcass would stay there until someone came to clean it up. If somebody died in your tenement, you weren't allowed to touch them, move them, bury them. You had to wait for a coroner to arrive and examine the body. And there was a limited number of coroners in New York at the time. So some of these people were being told you need to leave the body in the tenement for 2-3 days. And again, it's 120 degrees inside some of these tenements. But the coroners couldn't get there in time. Their workload was just too crazy. Now, if you felt yourself getting sick and you were somehow able to get to Bellevue Hospital despite the lack of ambulances available, then maybe doctors could give you an ice bath or try to lower your body temperature with ice. But the number of people who died whose body temperatures had exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit was still very staggering. Now, let's say I wanted to get some ice in 1896. Where the heck am I supposed to go? So ice manufacturers used to harvest the ice from large bodies of water, like rivers or lakes or whatever. And they would put the ice in a box that was lined with tin or zinc. And this is how people used to keep their food and milk from spoiling. An ice magnate named Charles Morse came to New York from Maine and bought out a bunch of ice companies, consolidated them, and had a little bit of an ice monopoly all to himself. Now, this started to frighten the people of New York because they figured he'd increase these prices, and by the summertime, it would be very difficult to come by, particularly for the poor. That's exactly what happened. As I mentioned before, the government was completely useless to the poor at this point. In fact, the mayor didn't hold an emergency meeting regarding this heat wave until day 10. However, one man stepped up, the police commissioner, who said, "Let's give away free ice to the poor." 5 years later, he was running the entire country. His name was Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt not only championed this idea, but he oversaw it. He would go through the back alleys of some of the worst tenements in the country and observe how the poor were using this free ice. He'd watch fathers chip away at the ice and give little pieces to children for them to suck on, for them to cool down. Or he'd watch mothers wrap it in handkerchiefs and create cooling towels for the sick people in the tenement. It's funny that Teddy Roosevelt is often thought of as this Western cowboy. He's the only Manhattan-born president. Teddy Roosevelt was very wealthy. His family in the earlier days of New York owned a 50-acre farm in what we now call Midtown Manhattan, in case you're trying to figure out how they made their money. But he always had a soft spot for bettering urban politics. Now, he's not distributing ice with intentions of obtaining votes. He's banking on William McKinley becoming president, and he'd get his comfy DC job through him. But this would help to shape his progressive political mindset. The 1896 heat wave killed 1,300 New Yorkers and another 200 people in Chicago and Boston. So that's going to do it. Remember, I'm Mike, the NYC Storyteller. If you enjoyed watching today's video, please make sure to like the video down below. You can comment, you can subscribe, all that good stuff. And until next time, wow, I'm still bad at this.